Hello political scientists, welcome to another 10-minute video. And this 10-minute video I'm going to be talking about voting behaviour. You may recall that there are certain areas that you can look at when trying to ascertain why people vote the way they do. There's class difference, there's region, there's media influence, age, gender, and tribal statistics, for want of a better phrase. So in the old days, class, and if you remember that's divided into A, B, C, D, E1 and E2. Or is it C1 and C2? C1 and C2, my apologies. That's one way of doing it. You can also group those together when you're looking at stats and figures. There's A, B, C1 and C2, D, E. D and E tend to include people who are older and on pensions, and they also tend to include higher rates of, well, it's C2 and D that include the higher rates of those who voted Leave during the referendum in 2016. Now, historically speaking, Labour tended to do better with lower class voters, or rather people of a lower class level, the working classes, if you will, because that's who they traditionally stood for, whereas ABs tended to vote mainly for Conservatives. Since 2015, we've seen a shift in that. We've seen more AB voters for Labour, especially in 2017, and we've seen more D and E voters for the Conservatives, especially in 2019. So there are changes. Part of this is political de-alignment. It used to be that you voted your class political tribe regardless, whereas nowadays people tend not to. We've had a shift in class consciousness, for want of a better term. So class doesn't play as much of a role now as it used to on those bases. However, that doesn't mean it plays no role. There is still generally a trend that ABC2 voters vote for the Conservatives and C2DE generally vote for Labour. That hasn't really changed, regardless of all the other changes we've seen. In terms of age, we have seen some changes. It used to be that older people voted for Conservatives and younger people voted for Labour. There was a brief turnaround in the 1960s and 70s into the 80s where the sort of middle age brackets tended to vote more Conservative. And indeed in the early 80s, young people voted more for Conservatives as well. In 2017 and 2019, in 2017 in particular actually, we saw that graph that looks like that, where the voters for Conservatives tended to be among the elders in the population, and the young tended to vote for Labour. 2019 gave us a bit of change in that. There were more young people voting for Conservatives. Not more than voted for Labour, but more than had done in 2017, meaning there'd been a bit of a shift. Generally speaking, the story of 2019 is that Labour lost votes everywhere, in all brackets. We also talk about region. The Midlands tend to vote more Conservative. The North East, North West tend to vote more Labour. That just is a thing. So you could argue that region plays a role. But what we spotted in 2017 were that there were gains made in cities by Labour. Labour became more metropolitan, and those cities and university towns in particular. Whereas in 2019, Labour lost pretty much everywhere based on what they gained in 2017, and the Conservatives gained mostly in the Midlands, weirdly enough, though there were gains to be had in the North East, though generally speaking that appears to be a drop in turnout. The turnout, by the way, was 67.3% for the 2019 election. The other thing we've seen is gender. Back in the 50s and 60s, women tended to vote more prevalently for the Conservatives, whereas in 2017, 2019, changing around about 1997, women tend to vote more for Labour and the Lib Dems. Another big change has been since 2005, the SNP's rise. When we talk about region, that seems to play a huge role. More people vote for the SNP than vote for Labour or the Conservatives, and in some cases, even more than those two things put together. So what seems to be the problem here? We've got political de-alignment, where people no longer vote for the party right or wrong. And we've also got class de-alignment, where people don't tend to vote along class lines anymore. That doesn't mean they don't. There's still evidence to suggest that it is still a huge role to be played. But there is evidence that it is changing. And part of that is down to the way that media operates. Media used to be very clearly segregated between the two major parties. You had newspapers that supported Labour, you had newspapers that supported the Conservatives, you had TV outlets that were essentially impartial and TV outlets that were a bit more partial. over time what's happened is that media on the TV and the press has become more pro-establishment. That is, it follows the government, whoever it is. So whoever's in power tends to get more of a fair trade from the media than those who are not. And that tends to be borne out, especially in 2017 and 2019. Though it's telling that when the rules of impartiality were imposed in 2017, Labour got far more airtime and suddenly jumped in popularity. That was not repeated in 2019 for whatever reason. So when we're talking about why people vote the way they do, how influenced are they by the media? Well, on the one hand, you could say that has increased significantly. The media tends to play a much larger role. In 2017 shows that starkly in the leap in popularity by Labour when they had more of a fair crack of the whip in terms of airtime and in terms of treatment in news media online. Sorry, not online, on TV. Social media also plays a huge role. 2019 showed the power of dark ads that you don't know who they were paid for, and the targeting of those ads. An example would be the targeting of ads on Facebook about how a local area would receive, I think it was £19 million, which was actually spread out over the whole country. But no one knows who paid for these ads, and the algorithm that said that you saw them is opaque. I saw them, which is weird. And I didn't see a single advert from left-leaning parties, despite having quite a left-leaning profile online. One would therefore assume that these were deliberately targeted at people who were not terribly active, but were otherwise left-wing, almost as though it was paid for by the Conservative Party. I believe that social media is now more important than print media in terms of shaping people's views. But most people live in echo chambers, so it's very hard to quantify that or to do that anecdotally. One thing remains true: print media influences TV media, and in the UK, print media is held in a very high regard indeed. What the papers say is a radio article and indeed on every morning TV show. As a consequence, news on TV, despite having the rolling 24-hour variety, tends to take its lead from highly partial print media, of which most is pro-conservative. So perhaps media and age were definitely obvious in 2017. Whether or not they're more important than background, class, and region or gender is difficult to say. Ethnicity, by the way, generally speaking, is quite simple. They tend to vote more for Labour, and that was true even in 2019, though Labour again lost votes in that area. I'm only talking about the main two parties. You could mention Lib Dems as well. Lib Dems tend to be the home of disgruntled Tory voters rather than disgruntled Labour voters, though there was a small but noticeable trend of Labour voters voting Lib Dem in 2019, though nowhere near the kind of numbers of Tories that did the same in 1997 onwards, implying that the Lib Dems are more a home of Tory voters than they are of Labour voters who are disgruntled. And they have a very small category that is solely Lib Dem, based on what we know from general election results. The other thing to keep in mind is that each of these features only work in conjunction with others. So when you're talking about gender or age, on their own, they cannot fully explain the stats and figures that you see underneath them. Rather, you have to use multiple factors to explain why people vote the way they do. What is likely to happen in an exam, therefore, is that you are likely to have to compare and contrast different aspects in why people vote the way they do. If it were a source question, it is likely that the source will give you 3 or 4 different factors in deciding how people vote, and your job is to then compare and contrast them. And my suggestion will be to use different elections in that instance. If you're given a particular general election, then you can use different factors in that instance. If it's an essay question, then it gets easier. You can start talking with a more broad brush stroke. You can start bringing in figures from across different general elections. And equally, those are the only two style of questions. It is likely that they will turn up. It's a perennial issue. And if they do, it's fact and figure based. So know the stats. I'm not sharing them with you on this 10-minute video. It's 10 minutes. You can look up the stats yourself. I'm explaining how they might be used. Region and class, for example, work well together. Age and gender work well together. The media influence on a campaign, we've done. You've got the evidence of the campaigns in 2015, 2017, and you lived through the 2019 campaign and created your own election videos, so you should know about that as well. I've now gone over 10 minutes. However, I hope that this has been a useful glimpse into the world of electoral behaviour and why people vote the way they do. Thank you for watching if you have been, and I shall see you around. Have a good day.